Revolutions have many different interpretations. For some people, it's just a change of government, a violent change usually, an overthrow of government. I think for others, it's more than that. It's not simply a change in government, but a change, a fundamental change in the society and social relationships.
What drives people to get involved? Somewhere between hope and fear, vision and desperation. People get involved for all sorts of reasons because revolutions are never simple things.
I suppose it's a sense of being aggrieved, of feeling that the existing order is unfair, unjust, and something has to be changed. A willingness to risk one's life eventually, ultimately, for changing the order.
It's a matter, I think, of a coalition of people coming together and ultimately agreeing on a great big question. Should we still have a monarchy in France? Should we break from Great Britain or stay with Great Britain? And people approach that question from different points of view.
The Americans in the 1760s, 1770s were ripe for revolution, though I don't believe they knew it at the time. They would have been horrified. They were proud to be Englishmen, and I think that's what we forget. They loved being English. But looking back, we can see that the conditions were there if the right things happened or the wrong things happened, depending upon which side you were on.
Before 1776, Americans had almost unwittingly and without any planning effected a revolution that transformed the nature of the old 17th century colonies. First of all, Americans had developed a new political order. They effectively developed legislatures. And American politics was marvelously participatory in its character.
They also were steeped in the English tradition of rights. They knew about the Magna Carta. They knew about John Locke's notion that we all had certain natural rights, life, liberty, and property, that we had the right to revolution.
When you add together a new kind of political order and American materialism and the development of a widely broadcast New World economy, and when you add to that then different nationalities, you had a society that looked utterly unlike Old World society. This was a revolutionary society, not yet revolutionary in political principle, but revolutionary in social context, revolutionary in its economy, revolutionary in its politics. It was a modern society.
In the mid-18th century, the North American continent was a playing field where European nations competed. The coveted prize was dominion over the rich, vast land itself. The British colonists were, for the most part, proud of their identity as British citizens. In 1754, when war broke out with the French over land in the Ohio Valley, the colonists supported the mother country. They contributed supplies for the British Army, as well as troops of their own, like the Virginia militia, which included the young George Washington. To coordinate this effort, London officials ordered the colonies from Virginia northward to send delegates to convene in Albany, New York. Members of the Iroquois Nation were also invited to Albany, in hopes that they would support the British cause, or at least remain neutral.
The plan behind the Albany Congress was to get as many colonies together as possible, to discuss ways to coordinate and pay for military defense of the colonies. And this had not been an issue before, but there'd never been the threat of a kind of a pan-Indian war on the western frontier.
What actually happened is that a few colonists, and Benjamin Franklin was the primary instigator in this regard, decided that as long as some of the colonists were getting together to talk to Indians, maybe they would get together and talk to each other as well. And they would develop what became known as the Albany Plan of Union. It was an ambitious plan. Its greatest significance was that it came from the colonists. They were the ones who created this. Everybody at the Congress signed on to it, or most people did. Then they sent it off to the various colonies to be ratified, and not one colony accepted it.
The Albany Congress is a foreshadowing of Congresses that will come in the next decade. It indicates that in 1754, the colonies weren't ready to surrender autonomy. They didn't see themselves as part of a large unit yet.
In the French and Indian War, the colonies were pawns in a larger struggle for global dominance. After the Treaty of Paris in 1763, the American playing field would never look the same. The defeated French departed the board altogether. Some of their Indian allies were now declared enemies, and British troops were left behind to defend the colonies against them. Before long, the British were facing off against the colonists over who would pay for this protection.
In 1763, the English proclaimed something called the Proclamation Line. What they wanted to do was keep the English colonists along the seacoast and keep the Indians to the west. And what they did was keep some English troops along the Proclamation Line to try to preserve that border. And they wanted Americans to pay for that. The problem was Americans didn't even want the soldiers there, and they did not want to pay for it with taxes enacted by Parliament. But it was, in terms of the actual money, that really wasn't the issue. The issue was more, do they have a right to tax us? Do we want these British soldiers here? We thought they were all going to go home after the war and we were going to go out west and make all this money, and all of a sudden those opportunities were closed to them and they were being taxed for the first time by Parliament.
I will to my dying day oppose, with all the powers and faculties God has given me, all such instruments of slavery on the one hand and villainy on the other, as this writ of assistance is.
In 1760, tension between Britain and the colonies began to escalate when the British applied to renew the writs of assistance.
The easiest way to describe them is to say that they were general search warrants. They were used in the colonies to board ships to find out whether the colonists were smuggling any goods into the colonies, which many times they were. This had been going on for a long, long time and nobody had ever questioned it. But in 1761, there was a big trial in Boston in which James Otis became one of the leading spokesmen for the merchants and demanded that the writs of assistance not be renewed.
This wanton exercise of power, what a scene does this open? Every man, prompted by revenge, ill humor, or wantonness to inspect the inside of his neighbor's house, may get a writ of assistance. Others will ask it from self-defense. One arbitrary exertion will provoke another until society be involved in tumult and blood.
The passionate lawyer's performance in Boston's Old State House drew quite a crowd. One witness at the trial, another Boston lawyer named John Adams, described Otis as a flame on fire. Otis's opening argument framed many of the fundamental philosophical arguments that would fuel the American Revolution.
An act against the Constitution is void. An act against natural equity is void. And if an act of Parliament should be made, in the very words of this petition, it would be void.
What Otis did was argue that there were certain natural rights that no government could abrogate. So he was talking about limited government. He was saying there are some things that Parliament cannot do. At the time, I'm not sure how meaningful that was, but later on, that kind of argument would become more and more and more popular, and so he kind of laid the groundwork.
James Otis lost the court case, but his arguments took on a life of their own. The Declaration of Independence, written 15 years later, begins with an appeal to the same higher law to which Otis had referred. And Otis's arguments on privacy,
a man's house is his castle,
were still resonating in 1789 when James Madison sat down to write what would become the Fourth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution.
The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated.
One of the most vital consequences of Otis's courtroom performance was its example of how eloquent and inflammatory words could arouse the population to action.
Every man of a crowded audience appeared to me to go away, as I did, ready to take arms against writs of assistance. Then and there was the first scene of the first act of opposition to the arbitrary claims of Great Britain. Then and there, the child independence was born.
In the winter of 1765, conflict between the colonists and the mother country intensified over the Stamp Act. By imposing a tax on a wide range of colonial documents, the British Parliament hoped to raise money to help pay off the national debt. The colonists were incensed.
First of all, at the level of principle, the Stamp Act did threaten to undercut the power of the colonial assemblies, and that's where the colonial elites had their power, so they felt threatened. Secondly, it was going to reach into practically everybody's pocket at one point or another, whether you're talking about a gambler going down to the tavern to buy a new deck of cards, or a couple who are going to get married, or somebody who's taking out an indenture to become a servant, or you're buying or selling land, any of that. It was going to reach into these people's lives.
They wanted to pay for those soldiers out there in the proclamation line. They wanted to pay for administrative costs. They saw the Stamp Act as a fair tax, as a small tax, one that would hit everybody more or less evenly, that nobody would have to pay too much. And they saw this as an excellent practical administrative expedient. I think that they were stunned. They didn't quite know what they were doing, or certainly did not know how it would be regarded in America.
Mass protests against the pending Stamp Act erupted throughout the colonies. In genteel, tree-shaded Charleston, a furious mob calling themselves Sons of Liberty erected a 40-foot-high gallows. There they hung an effigy of a stamp distributor. Inscribed at the base was the phrase, "Liberty and no Stamp Act." In many a colonial tavern, one could find white colonists discussing the need to defend themselves against slavery and to fight to preserve their liberty at all costs. Pamphlet writers throughout the colonies warned that submission to the Stamp Act would
deprive them of every privilege, distinguishing free men from slaves.
How is it that the loudest yelps for liberty come from the drivers of Negroes?
Which was Samuel Johnson, of course, in London in 1776. And he meant that thing to sting, that question to sting. I think that when they start using this language in 1765, 66, they don't realize how hypocritical it actually sounds. All they mean really is that their property can be taken from them without their say-so. They don't appreciate where the language is going.
Convinced of the justice of their cause, the colonists were prepared to fight tooth and nail to protest what they saw as taxation without representation. While the rabble rioted, political leaders of the colonies convened a Stamp Act Congress.
The Stamp Act Congress was composed of men sent from each colony. They petitioned the king in very polite language and assured the king that they understood that Parliament did have sovereignty over the colonies, but that the Stamp Act was ill-advised and that ought to be rescinded.
Facing widespread resistance, the British repealed the Stamp Act. However, Parliament made a point of asserting that, in principle, Britain had every right to tax her colonists. This only deepened resentments on both sides of the Atlantic.
That's why when Parliament repeals the Stamp Act in 1766, it passes the Declaratory Act, which is an empty, hollow shadow of a thing, but it says we can do anything we want. We've got the power. The issue shifts from the problem of paying the imperial debt or paying the cost of running the empire to the problem of who is in charge.
In 1768, after Bostonians had demonstrated they would not remain passive, the British sent troops to occupy the city.
Both sides created tension in the years between 1768 and 1770 when the Boston Massacre took place. The British came in, many of the soldiers who weren't paid enough tried to get jobs in town, which hurt Americans who were trying to get those same jobs. They drove up the cost of housing. They drove up the cost of food. Americans, on the other hand, did not exactly receive these troops with open arms. They had always been suspicious of standing armies in time of peace. That was one thing that was not allowed in England, and yet here it was happening in America. Tensions arose, barroom brawls, taunting, just general unease. Nobody was happy with those troops.
You damned rascally scoundrel, lobster son of a right being here.
On the night of March 5th, 1770, a roving band of young Bostonians came upon a lone red-coated sentry. The mob started taunting the British soldier, hurling objects, snowballs, and insults.
Kill him! Kill him! Knock him down!
The sentry called for help, and the situation quickly escalated.
Damn your bloods! I'll make a lane through you all!
Fire! 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 Damn you! Damn you! You can't kill us all!
The soldiers tried to use their bayonets to establish some breathing room as the crowd continued to push forward.
My lads, they will not fire.
It is true that the soldiers had been severely provoked when the so-called massacre occurred, but nevertheless, when all was said and done, 5 Americans were dead, and they were killed at the hands of British soldiers. And the propaganda value of that incident was tremendous, in the hands particularly of people like Samuel Adams and Paul Revere. Samuel Adams went to him and asked him to make an etching of the Boston Massacre, which you'll have in practically every U.S. history book today. And Revere said that he wasn't there, and Adams said, well, I wasn't there either, but I'll tell you what it looked like.
It was a great source of propaganda. Paul Revere created a really graphic poster, broadside as they called them at the time, showing coffins and showing a highly exaggerated image of what supposedly had gone on in King Street in Boston. What he printed was nothing like what really did happen. But it was a great way of spreading the word elsewhere that the British meant business and the colonists were in danger.
You've got the huge, huge soldiers, and you've got the colonists kind of all going back like this, like they're being attacked without any provocation at all. And you've got a little dog that's playing in the background. So, I mean, it looks as though you've got innocent liberty being attacked by ferocious, tyrannical power. And that's exactly the picture that Samuel Adams wanted people to get.
An effective and favorite tactic of revolutionary protest against British actions was to boycott products in general from England. And the kinds of products that Americans were in the habit of buying from England tended to be domestic products, products for the household, textiles, tea, things that would be useful for not only men to use, but for women to use as well. And so there was a gendered dimension to the boycotts, and women were asked to show their support and solidarity for the revolution by refusing to drink tea, by signing petitions that said they would not consume tea. Tea got invested with a lot of political meaning during the American Revolution. The Townsend Duties had put taxes on an enumerated list of articles that were imported into the colonies. And in response to massive colonial civil disobedience around the issues of the Townsend Duties, Britain removed all of them except for the tax on tea. And the tax on tea was maintained as a reminder that Britain had the right to tax the colonies. It wasn't particularly onerous, but it became a hot political issue again a few years later.
The East India Tea Company was going broke. One of the reasons it was going broke was that Americans were not buying East India tea. Why weren't they buying it? Because there was a tax on East India tea, and to pay that would be admitting that they would accept taxation without representation.
Britain manipulated the law yet again in order to create an economic advantage for a particularly favored tea company.
They passed something known as the Tea Act, which reformed the way that tea was brought into the colonies, made it cheaper to buy tea from England, The English assumed that if you could make them buy cheap tea, they would be willing to do it because they were convinced that all the colonists were cared about was pocketbook issues anyway. American patriots saw this as a bribe, which it was, and as a result, the Boston Tea Party occurred, and the beginning of the end really was at hand.
In New York City, a crowd of 2,000 stood in the rain to demonstrate support for a total ban on tea. In Philadelphia, the Sons of Liberty proclaimed any merchant trading East India tea an enemy to his country. In Charleston, mounds of unsold tea piled up because tea agents had abandoned their posts in fear. And in Boston, on the night of December 16, 1773, a group of men led by Samuel Adams dressed up as Mohawk Indians and sneaked aboard a cargo ship in Boston Harbor. There they spent 3 hours dumping 342 chests of tea into the drink.
We were all throwing tea overboard. We catch someone in our party trying to stuff some of the tea in his pockets. He is stripped of his booty and his clothes, and we send him home naked in disgrace. Then we went home in an orderly fashion. Boston enjoys the most peaceful night that it's had in many months.
This was how George Hughes, one of the participants, remembered the Boston Tea Party. However, Lord Lyttelton of England saw it otherwise.
Now, in the province of Massachusetts Bay, you have no government, no governor. You have only the proceedings of a tumultuous and riotous rabble.
The British Parliament, furious about the insurrection in Boston, passed a series of punitive measures known as the Coercive Acts. The colonists, however, dubbed them the Intolerable Acts.
The Coercive Acts were passed specifically to get Boston in particular and Massachusetts in general. The English were furious at the Boston Tea Party. To be fair, a lot of American colonists were taken aback by it at first, until the Coercive Acts, and then they changed their minds and saw Bostonians as heroes. People looked at what happened to Massachusetts and said, man, if it can happen there, it can happen to us. We've got to do something about this. And as a result, they met at the First Continental Congress to try to figure out how to respond to the Coercive Acts.
Committees of correspondence got the word out, and in September 1774, every colony except Georgia sent delegates to a Continental Congress in Philadelphia. During the 7-week-long meeting, the delegates passed a series of resolutions outlining what they perceived their rights to be. They resolved to boycott British goods, set up a Continental Association to enforce that resolution, and agreed to meet again the following spring for a Second Continental Congress. The delegates, all leaders in their communities, were motivated by different objectives. The Massachusetts patriot Sam Adams wanted a full-scale denunciation of all parliamentary control of the colonies. By contrast, Joseph Galloway of Pennsylvania sought to cool the inflammatory talk of revolution and patch up relations with the mother country. George Washington, who had seen firsthand the vast promise of the land west of the Appalachians, was ready to raise and lead an army, if necessary at his own expense. The high-minded John Adams carried with him a vision of a new society based on merit rather than social status. But it was the great orator Patrick Henry who expressed the crucial idea that was fast becoming a reality.
The distinction between Virginians and New Englanders is no more. I am not a Virginian, but an American.
The movement towards colonial unity that had begun in Albany in 1754 was solidified with the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. In a mere 20 years, the players, the strategies they were willing to employ, and even the rules of the game had changed. As a result, a national consciousness had emerged. The colonists were no longer willing to be cast in the role of pawns. They saw themselves as knights prepared to do battle in the name of liberty, even if this meant openly checking the authority of their king.
The Albany Congress in 1754 was an attempt to unify the colonies in the threat of a serious war, but it didn't work. By 1774, We have moved through 20 years of increasing political activity, an increasing politicization of not just the leaders in the American colonies, but men in the streets as well, and women as well, who had participated in boycotts. There was a great deal more information available in print, in pamphlets, in newspapers, and through demonstrations about the constitutional issues at stake. Some sort of unification, loosely considered, seemed the only reasonable response to England.
They saw themselves as Englishmen in 1754. By 1774, they were saying, we can't be virtually represented. We are too different from you. There are things about us that you don't understand. We don't trust you. And as a result, I think people were, if not ready for independence, certainly not ready to embrace England with that wholehearted sense of we're all in the same family that they had been 20 years earlier.
I'd say that once Parliament decided in 1766 that its own dignity and prestige and power were at stake, and that this was a fundamental issue in terms of what it meant to be a British person, the American Revolution probably was inevitable, because by that point, most people on the western side of the Atlantic had a different understanding of being British than did people in Great Britain.
In retrospect, things do look inevitable. Given the series of events, given the cultural attitudes of people on both sides, it's hard to look back and see a way out of this. There were statesmanlike proposals made to try to prevent the breakup of the empire, and they get rejected on both sides.
If you were standing in 1765, you would not think an American Revolution was inevitable. By 1775, it clearly was inevitable, I think. And as we look back on it from our time today, boy, how could it have worked out differently?